I'm Josh Davis. I'm a professor of conservation science at the Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation out in Front Royal. So when traffic is light, an hour from Fairfax, generally longer than that, unfortunately. Work with two of our programs out there, mostly wildlife ecology and conservation that we offer in the fall. And then the spring, I primarily work with endangered species conservation. But I also work with our third program that we offer out there called Conservation, Biodiversity, and Society. By training, I'm a research ecologist, so I study primarily disturbance effects on forested ecosystems. And while those direct disturbance effects are really interesting, what really fascinates me and the reason why I find it so interesting are those secondary and tertiary effects. So things like if you have a species lost from a forest, you have a disturbance that causes you to lose one species or one genus, what happens to ecosystem processes if that, when another tree takes the place of that species that you have lost? How does that affect things like carbon cycling? How does that affect things like hydrology? So it's those secondary, tertiary effects. What happens after that initial disturbance goes through, and how does that affect ecosystem processes? I find it absolutely fascinating. Because it's a niche that wasn't being terribly filled, or I guess that's probably not wholly accurate. A lot of people study forest dynamics. A lot of people look at successional processes. A lot of people look at how forests are affected by climate change. This sort of what happens next after that initial thing is a less studied area. There's certainly those out there that study it, but it doesn't get quite as much attention. And I find it really fascinating because those effects are often interactive. So as an example, something that we published relatively recently, we're losing ash from our forests due to emerald ash borer. And the litter from ash trees tends to be really high in nitrogen content. So if you replace that with another species, that then affects decomposition rates, and that can then affect carbon storage in soils. But we're also seeing that there's changes in hydrology, which also affects decomposition rates. And so we don't really know how those two interactive effects are going to play out over the next couple of decades. It's really complex, and that can make it really challenging and sometimes really frustrating. But I find that sort of stuff really very fun. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Michigan back in the late 90s. My degree's resource ecology and management, and I always joke that I was never trained to actually manage anything. The school was not well designed to train forest managers, but it was really well designed to train ecologists and those that might be a little bit more interested in the higher level theory of how ecosystems work rather than the on the ground. How do I manage this forest to produce whatever that might be, or manage this fishery to produce whatever you might have of interest. I didn't really know when I finished school what I was going to do with it. I knew I loved ecology, and I knew I loved science. I also had an interest in education. I thought very briefly about changing my major to be middle school or high school education. And so I sort of fell into a job at a local nature center teaching summer camps. So students would come out, they spend a week with us for a whole day at a time, and we taught about ecology. We talked about insects, we talked about trees, we talked about the gamut of things that that might be of interest to middle and high school students. And that turned into my career for the next decade or so, 11 years, I guess. So I spent time at a couple of different nature centers. I worked in Minnesota briefly, and then I ended up at a place in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where I was for 7 years, give or take. And there I was teaching classes, but I was also developing research projects for the students to engage with. So we would develop these citizen science projects that were created such that the data could be reliably collected by middle and high school students, but would also yield results that are actionable by the scientific community. So looking at long-term trends in salamander populations and how those are affected by changes in forests and changes in climate. And that was where I realized that my interest in science went beyond knowing what kind of tree is out there, knowing what that bird singing behind me might be, and was really interested in being able to answer scientific questions. So back 11 years or so after I finished my undergrad, I returned to a PhD at Michigan Technological University, and ended up there partly because I really wanted to get back to Michigan. A little bit of a bias from my home state, but also because of a program in which, funded by the National Science Foundation, that was getting primarily doctoral students, I think a few master's students as well, working in local classrooms, sharing your science and developing curriculum materials that are then made available on the web. Things that are trying to connect the science, the current science, the stuff that's being done right now, very cutting edge. I'm not gonna say mine's very cutting edge, but it's current anyway. And getting that into the hands of, again, middle and high school teachers, and getting students engaging with that current science, the data that's just now being collected, that research that we're just now doing. I thought it was a fascinating program, and it really suited me well because of my background in working with those age groups. I've been a nature nerd since I was, 2 years old. I take literally, I am not exaggerating in any way. I got a field guide when I was 6 or 7, something like that. And so the stories go, I was constantly out in the yard trying to identify the weeds that were growing along the fence. Like, there wasn't any real question that I was going to do something in the sciences. It was just more a matter of what were you going to do. Like I said, I considered working with middle and high school, teaching science there. It turns out that I am not one of those people who has the level of patience required to be a middle or high school teacher. My attitude, my skill set is much better suited to working with older students rather than younger students. I think one of the most common things that I remember feeling when I first got into my undergraduate program, and that seems very common amongst a lot of students when they're first starting out at the university, is that they no longer feel like the smartest person in the room. They were probably pretty successful in high school, got into some good universities, and you get there and you are suddenly the small fish in a really, really big pond. And I think that really bothers a lot of students. That sort of, it ends up being a lack of confidence. Well, if I'm not the smartest person in the room, then I don't have anything to contribute. And I would argue the exact opposite of that. I think that feeling of not being the smartest person in the room is something that you should relish, and is something that you should seek out. Over the course of your 4 years as an undergraduate, that feeling is going to change, and suddenly you do have some knowledge, you do have things to share. That feeling of a lack of confidence, perhaps in your own skills and abilities, is going to go away a little bit, but it's going to happen all over again, right?
Yeah.
And, you're gonna feel bad, and you're no longer, again, you don't feel like you're the smartest or one of the smartest in the room. I've always told students that if you ever reach a point where you really feel like you're the smartest person in the room, and that's gonna happen to you at some point where you really are, you're in the wrong room. You're not growing anymore if you are the smartest person in the room, if you're the one with the most knowledge. You need to find a different room. You need to be somewhere where you can continue to grow, you can continue to push yourself, and really embracing that feeling of, I'm not the smartest person. I can get so much out of working with these other people, I think is a really valuable, but also a really challenging attitude to have. So seek out those opportunities to not be the smartest one in the room, and realize that feeling of a little bit of a lack of confidence in your own skills and abilities is ubiquitous. It's 100% of us, 99.9% of us have felt that at some point or another. And it's really a good thing. It's an opportunity for growth. I think the only other one that I would say, and this has to do with what you were just talking about, Jerry, not everyone knows right away what they want to do with their lives, careers, what they want to study, things along those lines. I finished undergraduate and I was out in the workforce for more than 10 years before realizing that what I really wanted to do is I really wanted to talk about conservation and ecology with college students. It took that long for me to figure out that this is what I wanted to do and to figure out what steps I needed to take in order to be able to make that happen. Other people know right away, and there's nothing wrong with going straight from your undergraduate to your master's and whatever else needs to happen after that, going straight from undergraduate into your career. But not knowing isn't a bad thing. Sometimes you just need to be out there and gaining those life experiences and before you make that decision. So if you have any hesitancy when you're getting ready to graduate about, I don't know what to do, should I get a master's degree? Should I bop around for a little while and take some other jobs? My suggestion is, if you're not certain, don't start piling up those degrees, not knowing what you're necessarily going to do with them. Works really well for some people, but for others, go get some experiences, figure out what you really like. You can always come back.